Have you ever had a moment where your family's words cut deeper than any knife? A moment where you realize that the people who are supposed to be your biggest cheerleaders are actually your heaviest anchors? I have. And it happened at, of all places, my family's annual Christmas dinner. The air in my parents' house was thick with the scent of roasted turkey and pine needles, a combination that usually felt like a warm hug. Tonight, it felt suffocating. I sat at the grand dining table, a ghost at my own family's feast. My reflection in the polished wood showed a woman I barely recognized, thinner than last year, with shadows under her eyes that no amount of concealer could hide. I felt invisible, a placeholder in a chair that could have been empty for all anyone seemed to notice. Across from me, my Uncle Mark was holding court, as he always did. He was a man built of cheap cologne and loud opinions, his face ruddy from too much wine and self-satisfaction. He was a small-time real estate developer who acted like he was building empires. The city council folded like a cheap suit, he boomed, gesturing with a turkey leg. I told them, you can have my proposal, or you can have a vacant lot for the next 10 years. They knew who they were dealing with. My father, David, nodded enthusiastically, his eyes wide with admiration. That's telling them, Mark. You've got to have guts in this business. My mother, Susan, chimed in with a supportive murmur, refilling Mark's wine glass. They hung on his every word, their pride in him a stark, painful contrast to the apologetic glances they occasionally threw my way. 2 years ago, my own architectural startup, a company built on innovative eco-friendly designs, had crashed and burned. A larger corporation had stolen my concepts, bled me dry in a legal battle I couldn't afford, and left me with nothing but debt and a reputation as a failure. To my family, especially to Mark, I was a cautionary tale, a disappointment. The conversation drifted, and my grandma Helen, a woman whose sweetness was often a delivery system for unintentional cruelty, turned to Mark's son, my cousin, Michael. And Michael, that new sports car of yours is just breathtaking. You've worked so hard for it. Thanks, Grandma, Michael preened. Grandma Helen beamed. He deserved it. It's wonderful to see the young people in this family succeeding. That was all the opening Mark needed. He locked his eyes on me, a predatory smirk spreading across his face. The jovial atmosphere he'd been curating suddenly turned sharp and focused, like a spotlight in an interrogation room. "See, Amelia?" he said, his voice now loud enough to command the entire table's attention. "Some people earn nice things. They put in the work, and they get the rewards." He leaned forward, the wood of the table groaning under his weight. "So, tell us all, still living in that shoebox apartment in the city?" Silence. The clinking of forks stopped. Every eye was on me. My cousin fidgeted. My aunt looked away, but no one spoke. I felt my cheeks burn, a hot tide of Ave rising up my neck. I looked to my parents, my heart pleading with them to say something, anything, to tell Mark to back off, to defend their daughter. They didn't. My father stared intently at the gravy boat, as if it held the secrets of the universe. My mother busied herself arranging the green beans on her plate into a perfect, neat pile. Their silence was a betrayal far louder than Mark's words. He wasn't done. He delivered the final, brutal blow, his voice laced with a triumphant cruelty. "She deserved that praise, Amelia," he said, gesturing with his chin toward my grandmother. "Michael deserved that car. But you haven't earned a thing." The words hung in the air, an indictment, a public verdict on my worth. "You haven't earned a thing." It echoed the voice of the lawyers who bankrupted me, the investors who pulled out, the life I had lost. But hearing it here, at this table from my own family broke something inside me. Not my spirit, my tolerance. I carefully placed my fork and knife on my plate, the metallic clink, unnaturally loud in the dead quiet. "Excuse me," I said, my voice a low, steady whisper that surprised even me. I stood up, pushed my chair in, and walked out of the dining room without looking back. I could feel their stunned gazes on my back. I didn't get my coat. I just walked out the front door, into the biting December air. The cold was a relief, a shock to my system that cleared the hot fog of humiliation from my mind. I sat in my beat-up sedan, the engine off, the silence of the car a welcome sanctuary. I didn't cry. The tears wouldn't come. The part of me that felt hurt had been cauterized, burned shut by the heat of Mark's final insult. In its place, something else was taking root. It was cold, hard, and sharp. It was resolve. My failure wasn't just my own anymore. They had made it theirs. They had feasted on it. Now I would build my success on their ignorance. I started the car, but I didn't drive back to my tiny shoebox apartment. I drove to a brightly lit, sterile 24-hour cafe on the other side of town. I ordered a black coffee, opened my old scuffed laptop, and created a new folder on the desktop. I stared at the blinking cursor for a long moment. The image of my uncle's smug face burned into my memory. Then I typed the folder's name, Keystone. The war had begun. The fluorescent lights of the 24-hour cafe hummed, casting a sterile glow on my laptop screen. The smell of stale coffee and burnt sugar filled the air. Outside, the world was asleep, tucked into warm beds after a day of festive cheer. Inside, I was wide awake, fueled by black coffee, and a fury so pure it felt like a second heartbeat. My plan wasn't born of a fleeting, angry impulse. It was an excavation. I was digging up the brilliant woman I used to be before she was buried under an avalanche of lawsuits and shame. My failed startup, Ether Homes, wasn't a failure of design. It was a failure of protection. I had pioneered a system of creating beautiful, sustainable, modular homes that could be constructed at a fraction of the cost of traditional builds. They were my life's work, my passion, but I was a designer, not a corporate shark. A massive development firm, Omnicorp, saw my potential not as something to invest in, but as something to take. They feigned interest, got a look at my proprietary methods during the due diligence phase, and then pulled out only to launch their own revolutionary housing line 6 months later, a line built on the back of my stolen intellectual property. The legal fight was a joke. They had a team of 50 lawyers. I had one, a public defender's cousin who was trying his best. They bled me dry until I had to declare bankruptcy. Since then, for 2 long years, I had been living a ghost's life. I took a low-profile, soul-crushing remote drafting job for a firm in another state, converting old blueprints, teen digital files. It was mindless work, but it paid the bills and allowed me to slowly, painfully rebuild my savings. Every paycheck, I'd squirrel away whatever I could, living on the bare minimum. My family saw it as my real job, a step down that I had finally sensibly taken. They had no idea it was a means to an end. It was my secret war chest. Now it was time to deploy it. My revenge wouldn't be about getting rich. That was too simple, too much like Mark's shallow definition of success. It would be about proving my designs, my vision, were not just viable but superior. It would be about beating Mark at his own game, using the very intelligence he'd mocked. I spent that first night, and every night for the next week, combing through city zoning regulations, public records, and property tax databases. Mark's method was simple: buy land cheap, throw up a cookie-cutter house with cheap materials, and sell it based on square footage and curb appeal. He never bothered with the messy, complicated world of urban renovation. He saw old buildings as teardowns, not opportunities. And that's where I found it. A loophole. Section 14B of the city's updated zoning code. It was a dense, jargon-filled ordinance designed to incentivize green building practices. It offered massive tax abatements and waived certain permit fees for renovations that met specific eco-friendly and energy-efficient standards. It was a niche. Mark, with his disdain for anything that wasn't big and new, would be too arrogant and too lazy to ever notice. This was my way in. The next step was the hardest. I looked at my bank account. I had managed to save $42,000. It felt like a fortune and nothing at all. It wasn't enough. I walked into a bank, not a big national chain, but a smaller local credit union, and applied for a business loan. The loan officer, a tired-looking man named Mr. Harris, looked at my application, my bankruptcy record, and my low-income remote job. His expression was a polite mask for pity. "Miss Evans," he said, steepling his fingers, "your financial history is a significant hurdle. My last venture failed because my intellectual property was stolen, not because the business model was flawed," I said, my voice steady. I pushed a slim binder across the desk. It was a detailed proposal, complete with market analysis, cost projections, and a breakdown of the Section 14B tax benefits. "I'm not buying land. I'm buying an undervalued, dilapidated property and using a proven, low-cost modular interior system to transform it." He was skeptical, but he was also thorough. He read the proposal, he saw the numbers, he understood the loophole. A week later he called. The bank wouldn't give me a traditional business loan, but they would give me a high-interest, secured personal loan against the property itself. The terms were brutal. If I missed a single payment, I'd lose everything. Again. I took it. With the loan secured, I formed a ghost LLC. I needed a name with no connection to me. Something bland and corporate that would fly under the radar. I thought back to the very first stone in an ark, the one that bears all the weight and holds everything together. The Keystone Holdings, LLC, I typed into the online form. It sounded strong. Anonymous. 2 weeks later, Keystone Holdings LLC became the proud owner of a small boarded-up house in a transitional neighborhood. It was a wreck. The porch sagged, windows were broken, and the yard was a jungle of weeds. It smelled of mildew and decay. To anyone else, it was blight. To me, it was the first brick in my new empire. My life became a blur of tangible, visceral struggle. My days were for the remote drafting job, the one that paid the bills. My nights were for Keystone. I'd finish my shift at 5 p.m., grab a pack of instant noodles or a stale granola bar, and head straight to the property. I became my own project manager, coordinating the plumber, the electrician, the roofers. I learned to spackle and paint to save money. My hands, once skilled with a drafting pen, were now perpetually calloused and stained with paint. Exhaustion became my constant companion. It was a physical weight on my shoulders, a dull ache behind my eyes. Some nights, I'd fall asleep in my car parked outside the house, only to be jolted awake by the rising sun, the fear of failure a sour taste in my mouth. I'd sketch new layouts on the back of greasy fast food napkins, my mind racing with calculations and contingencies. Every dollar was accounted for. Every invoice felt like a potential dagger. This wasn't just a project. It was my one and only shot. The fear of another public humiliation, of Uncle Mark's smug "I told you so," was a more potent fuel than caffeine could ever be. I was running on fumes and fury, and I knew I was one bad day, one unexpected expense, away from complete and total ruin. For 6 weeks I lived on a knife's edge, but things were moving. The new roof was on, the windows were replaced, and the smell of mildew was finally being replaced by the clean scent, sawdust and fresh paint. I was walking a tightrope of financial anxiety, but I was walking it. I allowed myself a flicker of hope, a tiny spark in the suffocating darkness of my stress. Maybe, just maybe, this was going to work. That flicker was extinguished on a cold, rainy Tuesday morning. I got a call from my contractor, a grizzled, no-nonsense man named Frank. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Amelia, you need to get down here. Now." My heart hammered against my ribs. Frank's tone was the one doctors use before they give you bad news. I threw on a jacket over my pajamas and drove, the rain smearing the world outside my windshield into a watery blur. I arrived to find Frank standing in the gutted-out living room, staring down at a massive crack in the concrete slab that hadn't been visible before. He had a grim look on his face. "We were prepping for the new flooring," he said, pointing with a dirt-caked boot, pulled up the last of the old subfloor, and found this. It's not just a surface crack, it runs deep, the soil underneath has shifted, the foundation is compromised. I stared at the jagged line in the concrete. It looked like a raw wound. "What does that mean?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. My voice was small, thin. "It means we can't put a feather on this floor until it's fixed. We need to underpin the entire west wall. Excavate, pour new footings, reinforce it with steel. It's a big job." "How big?" I whispered, the words catching in my throat. Frank took off his cap and ran a hand through his thinning hair. He wouldn't meet my eyes. "Best case? $30,000. $30,000. The number hit me like a physical blow. It was a death sentence. I had precisely $1,412 left in the Keystone Holdings bank account, and that was earmarked for the electrician. The high-interest loan was a fixed amount. There was no more money. The project, my secret war, my one chance at redemption, it was all about to collapse into a pile of concrete dust. That afternoon, I went back to Mr. Harris at the credit union. I sat in the same chair, a hollowed-out shell of the determined woman who had sat there 2 months prior. I explained the situation, my voice cracking despite my best efforts to keep it steady. He listened patiently, his expression a mixture of sympathy and professional regret. "Amelia, I'm sorry," he said, his voice gentle. "The loan is secured by the property as is. We can't extend more credit on an asset with a compromised foundation. My hands are tied." I walked out of the bank into the cold, damp air. The world felt gray and muted. The fear wasn't just a taste in my mouth anymore. It was a poison flooding my veins. I saw it all playing out, the bank foreclosing, Frank putting a lien on the property for his unpaid work, the debt collectors calling, and the final crushing humiliation of telling my family that I had failed. Again, even more spectacularly this time, the image of Uncle Mark's face gloating and victorious flashed in my mind. No, I would not give him that satisfaction. That evening, I went to my small apartment, the shoebox Mark loved to mock. I opened a dusty box in the back of my closet. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was the last thing of real value I owned. It was a vintage watch, a classic 1960s Omega with a simple, elegant silver face and a worn leather strap. It had belonged to my grandfather. He was an engineer, a quiet, brilliant man who saw the world in lines and angles, just like me. He was the only one who had truly understood my ambition, who had looked at my early sketches, not as childish drawings, but as blueprints for the future. He gave it to me when I graduated from college. "For the moments you build that will stand the test of time," he'd said. He died a year before my company collapsed. Sometimes I felt like he was the only thing that had been holding my world together. I held the watch in my palm. Its weight felt substantial, a tangible link to his belief in me. Selling it felt like betraying him. It felt more painful, more personal, than the failure of my entire company. But the alternative, letting Mark win, was unthinkable. The next day, I walked into a pawn shop in a part of town I rarely visited. The air inside was stale, smelling of old paper and quiet desperation. Bells on the door chimed bleakly. A man with a bored, dismissive expression looked up from his newspaper as I approached the counter. "Help you," he grunted. My hand trembled as I placed the watch on the cold, scratched glass of the counter. I'd like to sell this." He picked it up, his movements slow and unimpressed. He squinted at it through a jeweler's loupe, popped the back off with a small knife, and grunted again. He didn't see a family heirloom. He didn't see my grandfather's faith or my last shred of hope. He saw gears and metal. "It's a decent movement," he conceded, "but the market's soft for these. I'll give you $3,000 for it." 3? My voice was a croak. It's worth 10 times that. He shrugged, already losing interest. Then sell it somewhere else. That's my offer. Take it or leave it. I couldn't leave it. I was out of options. The 30,000 from Frank was a best-case scenario. I had to pay his deposit to even get him to start. I had a tiny bit of my personal savings left, and a credit card I could max out. This 3,000 was the piece that would make it possible. Just barely. I'll take it, I said, the words feeling like ash in my mouth. He counted out 30 $100 bills, his thick fingers moving with practiced speed. He slid the pathetic pile of cash across the counter. I slid my grandfather's watch the other way. The transaction was over in less than a minute. I walked out of that shop feeling hollowed out, a piece of my soul amputated for cash. As I stood on the grimy sidewalk, clutching the bills in my hand, I made a silent vow. This wasn't goodbye. It was a loan. I would get the watch back. I would finish this house, and I would build an empire on the foundation of this sacrifice. And one day, I would walk back into that pawn shop and reclaim the last piece of my grandfather's faith in me. The months between that day at the pawn shop and Thanksgiving were a grueling, relentless marathon. The foundation repair ate every penny I had and then some. I maxed out my last credit card, and for 2 terrifying weeks I lived on a diet of saltine crackers and tap water, my stomach a tight, anxious knot. I pushed Frank and his crew hard, working alongside them whenever I could, hauling debris and painting trim until my muscles screamed in protest. My remote drafting job became a lifeline I clung to with fierce desperation, its steady paycheck the only thing keeping the lights on in my tiny apartment. By mid-November, a miracle had occurred. The house was finished. It was transformed. Where there had once been sagging porches and broken windows, there now stood a sleek, modern marvel of design. Inside, the modular system I had perfected years ago created a space that was open, filled with light, and incredibly energy efficient. It was beautiful. It was my vision made real. I put it on the market under the Keystone Holdings name, with a boutique real estate agent who specialized in unique properties. Then, silence. A week passed. Then 2. My agent assured me there was interest, that the design was getting a lot of buzz online, but no concrete offers had materialized. The high-interest loan payments were about to kick in. The credit card bill was a ticking time bomb. I was standing on the financial and emotional edge of a cliff, the wind of failure threatening to push me over. It was in this state of high anxiety that I was forced to attend the Evans family Thanksgiving dinner. The thought of facing them all, especially Uncle Mark, was nauseating. I considered faking a sudden illness, but a call from my mother, her voice laced with that familiar guilt-inducing disappointment, sealed my fate. "Amelia, please. It's Thanksgiving. Don't make things difficult." So I went. I wore a simple black sweater and jeans, a stark contrast to my Aunt Carol's jewel-toned cashmere dress. I felt like a crow in a flock of peacocks. The house was once again filled with the smells of roasting turkey and cinnamon. But this time, I was armed with a secret. It was a fragile shield, but it was better than nothing. Dinner was the usual performance. Mark dominated the conversation, his voice a self-important drone that filled every pocket of silence. He had moved on from his city council victory and was now obsessed with a new prize. "It's the perfect family home," he declared, carving the turkey with a flourish. "On Whisperwind Lane in the Oak Creek neighborhood. 5 bedrooms, a 3-car garage, mature oak trees. It's a real statement piece. The kind of house that says you've arrived." Aunt Carol beamed, adding, "The school district is the best in the state. It's simply ideal for the boys." My parents listened, their faces glowing with vicarious success. Oak Creek was the most prestigious, old-money neighborhood in the city. A house there was more than a home, it was a status symbol of the highest order. Mark had put in a strong offer, he told everyone, and was confident it would be accepted any day now. He was already planning the housewarming party. I stayed quiet, pushing mashed potatoes around my plate, trying to become invisible. But Mark's attention, like a heat-seeking missile, eventually found its target. He wiped his mouth with a napkin, leaned back in his chair, and fixed me with a look of theatrical pity. "Speaking of houses," he said, his tone dripping with condescension, "my buddy who runs the city permit office mentioned your name. Said you were doing some little arts and crafts project on that wreck of a house over by the industrial park." My spine went rigid. He knew, of course he knew. He made it his business to know everyone's business. He continued, a smirk playing on his lips. "Still playing with dollhouses, Amelia? I hope you're not throwing good money after bad. Some properties are just lost causes. You have to know when to cut your losses. It's a lesson you should have learned by now." Aunt Carol let out a small, tittering laugh. My father shifted uncomfortably in his seat, but as usual said nothing. The memory of selling my grandfather's watch, the feeling of utter desolation, flashed through me. The shame, the hunger, the back-breaking work, he was dismissing it all as a child's game. For a second, I wanted to scream. I wanted to tell him about the foundation, about the 18-hour days, about the genius of the design he was too ignorant to comprehend. I wanted to wipe that smug look off his face with the sheer force of my rage. But I didn't. Instead, I took a slow, deliberate sip of water. I met his gaze directly, holding it, and I smiled. It wasn't a big smile. It was a small, quiet, enigmatic curve my lips that didn't reach my eyes. It was the calmest I had felt all day. "Something like that, Uncle Mark," I said, my voice soft and even. My reaction, or lack thereof, seemed to throw him off. He had expected tears, or anger, or a defensive outburst. He had been winding me up for a fight, and I had simply refused to engage. My calm unnerved him more than any argument ever could have. He frowned, a flicker of confusion in his eyes, before turning back to his turkey. The conversation momentarily derailed. But in that moment, something inside me shifted. His target was no longer just me. It was my work, and now he had just handed me a new target of my own. A beautiful 5-bedroom statement house on Whisperwind Lane. The name Oak Creek echoed in my mind. He thought he was putting me in my place. He had no idea he was just showing me exactly where I needed to build my throne. The desperation that had been gnawing at me for weeks was replaced by a renewed, laser-focused determination. I just needed to sell my house. I just needed my first victory. The week after Thanksgiving was one of the longest of my life. The quiet from my real estate agent stretched into an agonizing silence. Each morning I woke up with a knot of dread in my stomach, the weight of the loan and the looming credit card payment pressing down on me. I reread Uncle Mark's condescending words in my mind, using them as fuel, but fuel doesn't pay the bills. I was beginning to think he was right, that I had thrown good money after bad, that my vision was just a delusion. The hope I'd clung to was fraying at the edges. Then, on a dreary Wednesday afternoon, my phone rang. It was my agent, Sarah. "Amelia," she said, and her voice was electric. It was the kind of voice that signaled a seismic shift. "Are you sitting down?" "Should I be?" I asked, my heart beginning to pound a frantic rhythm against my ribs. "We have an offer," she said. "No, wait. That's not right. We have a situation. A good one." I held my breath. What kind of situation? "A tech CEO who just relocated, saw the green certifications online," Sarah explained, talking fast. "He came for a private showing yesterday. He was blown away. He called it the future of urban living. He made a full-price, all-cash offer this morning. But before I could even call you, another offer came in. It's from a couple doctors at the university hospital. They'd been watching the listing. Their offer is $10,000 over asking." I sank onto the edge of my sofa, my legs suddenly weak. "2 offers?" "3," she corrected, and I could hear the grin in her voice. "The tech CEO just called me back. I told him we had a competing offer, and he immediately raised his by 50,000. Amelia, we don't have a sale. We have a bidding war. The words barely registered. A bidding war. On my house. The little arts and crafts project. The lost cause. Over the next 48 hours, I lived in a state of suspended disbelief as Sarah expertly played the two buyers against each other. The numbers kept climbing to a level that seemed absurd, fantastical. The final offer came from the tech CEO. It was a staggering figure, almost triple what I had invested in the property, including the foundation repair. When Sarah called with the final number, I made her repeat it 3 times. I wrote it down on a piece of mail, staring at the zeros. The knot of dread in my stomach didn't just loosen, it evaporated. In its place, a wave of profound, bone-deep relief washed over me, so powerful it almost brought me to my knees. I had done it. My designs, the ones Omnicorp had stolen and the world had forgotten, were not just validated, they were wildly, deliriously successful. The first thing I did after signing the sale papers wasn't to buy a bottle of champagne or book a vacation. I picked up my phone and made a different call. Chloe? I said. Chloe had been my first and only intern at Ether Homes. She was a whip-smart, fiercely loyal architecture student who had believed in my vision from day one. When the company went under, she was devastated. We had kept in touch, but I had been too ashamed to tell her the full extent of my struggles. Amelia, oh my God, hi, how are you? Her voice was a welcome burst of warmth and energy. I'm good, Chloe. Actually, I'm better than good, I said, a real smile spreading across my face for the first time in years. I have a question for you. How would you like a job? 2 days later, Chloe and I were signing a lease on a small but professional office space in a modest downtown building. There was no more working from my cramped apartment. I hired her as the official operations manager of Keystone Holdings, LLC. Her eyes lit up when I walked her through the business plan, the success of the first house, and the vision for the future. Seeing her belief in me, so pure and unwavering, was almost as gratifying as the money in the bank. My next stop was the bank. I walked up to the teller and paid off the entire high-interest loan in a single transaction. Then I paid off my maxed-out credit card. The feeling of being debt-free was a liberation I hadn't realized I was craving so badly. There was one last piece of business to attend to. I walked back into the pawn shop. The same bored-looking man was sitting behind the counter, reading the same newspaper. The bells on the door chimed, but this time they sounded different, less bleak. "Help you?" he grunted, not looking up. "I'm here to buy something," I said, my voice clear and confident. "A 1960s Omega watch. Silver face, leather strap. You bought it from me about 10 months ago." He finally looked up, a flicker of recognition in his eyes. He disappeared into a back room and returned a minute later, holding my grandfather's watch. He placed it on the glass counter. It looked smaller than I remembered, but just as beautiful. "It'll cost you more than I gave you for it," he said, gruffly. "I know," I replied, pulling a crisp stack of bills from my purse. "How much?" I paid his price without haggling. He pushed the watch across the counter. I picked it up, its familiar weight settling into my palm. I fastened the worn leather strap around my wrist. It felt like coming home. This wasn't just a watch, it was a promise kept, a piece of my soul reclaimed. As I walked out of the shop, the winter sun hit the silver face, making it gleam. I was no longer just surviving. I was no longer a victim. I was the owner of a successful Sunshine. I had a war chest in the bank, and my most trusted ally by my side. I was building an arsenal, and I knew exactly who my next target was. With the sale finalized and my grandfather's watch back on my wrist, Keystone Holdings transformed from a desperate gamble into a formidable operation. The profit from that first house was more than just money. It was rocket fuel. Chloe and I worked out of our new, sparse office, the walls covered in city maps, zoning overlays, and potential properties I had circled in red ink. We were a two-woman army, efficient and invisible. Chloe was a godsend. While I focused on the big picture, identifying undervalued properties and redesigning them in my head, she handled the logistics with ruthless precision. She managed the finances, vetted contractors, and dealt with the mountain of paperwork that came with real estate transactions. She was the engine that made my vision move. Keystone Holdings has just acquired 345 West Elm and 901 Canal Street, she'd report, her voice crisp and professional as she ticked items off a list. Both all-cash offers, closed within the week. The renovation crews are scheduled to start Monday. We moved quickly and quietly. We bought two more dilapidated houses in up-and-coming neighborhoods, properties Mark would have dismissed as teardowns. They were our bread and butter, the projects that would continue to build our capital and prove my design concept was scalable. While the renovation crews went to work on those, I turned my attention to the main event, the Oak Creek Gambit. I couldn't get Uncle Mark's smug, boastful voice out of my head. A real statement piece, he'd called the house on Whisperwind Lane. The kind of house that says you've arrived. He wasn't just buying a house, he was buying a trophy to display his superiority. Taking that trophy from him would be a statement of my own. This required a different level of strategy. I couldn't just be a bidder. I had to be a ghost in the machine. Chloe, using a contact from her university network, found a junior agent at the high-end firm that held the listing for the Oak Creek house. For a generous consulting fee, the junior agent was happy to provide us with some off-the-record information. The intel was gold. The owners of the house, a Dr. and Mrs. Albright, were in the middle of a spectacularly messy divorce. Mrs. Albright had already moved out, and Dr. Albright was desperate to sell quickly and quietly to liquidate their assets and avoid any more public drama. Uncle Mark's offer was strong, the agent confirmed, but it had a crucial weakness. It was contingent on financing. Like most developers, Mark leveraged the bank's money, not his own. It meant a standard 30 to 45-day closing period, full of appraisals and underwriting hurdles. Dr. Albright didn't want to wait 45 days. He wanted out. Now. This is our opening, I told Chloe, tapping the file on my desk. He's motivated by speed and discretion, not just price. We crafted our attack. Through a lawyer, acting on behalf of the anonymous Keystone Holdings, LLC, we made an offer that was designed to be irresistible to a man in Dr. Albright's position. We offered 10% more than Mark's bid, a figure high enough to make his jaw drop. But that wasn't the masterstroke. The offer was all cash with proof of funds attached. We waived all contingencies, and we could close in 7 days. There was one more clause, the most important one. We insisted on a confidentiality agreement, legally binding all parties, the sellers, the agents, the lawyers, to keep the details of the sale, including the buyer's identity, completely secret, until after the title was transferred and the deal was officially recorded with the city. This would prevent Mark from getting wind of a competing offer and trying to counter. He wouldn't know what hit him until it was far too late. It's aggressive, Chloe said, her eyes wide as she read the offer letter. It's beautiful. We sent the offer. The response was almost immediate. Dr. Albright accepted without a single counter. He was thrilled. A quick, clean, all-cash sale for more than he was asking for? It was the answer to his prayer. A week later, I was in a sterile lawyer's office, signing a mountain of paperwork. With the stroke of a pen, the grand, stately home on Whisperwind Lane, the symbol of everything my uncle valued, the statement piece he was already bragging about to anyone who would listen, now belonged to my ghost company. The power had shifted. It was a monumental landscape-altering victory, but it happened in complete silence. No one knew but me, Chloe, the lawyers, and the very relieved Dr. Albright. To the outside world, and to Uncle Mark, nothing had changed. He was still waiting for the sellers to accept his offer, blissfully unaware that the house had already been sold out from under him. He probably called his agent every day, growing more and more impatient, blaming the delay on the seller's drama. The week after the closing, I put the final piece of the plan in place. I had Chloe reach out to the Alberts lawyer. On behalf of the new, anonymous owner, she offered to lease the house back to them for 6 months at a very reasonable rate. This would allow them time to sort out their affairs without having to move immediately. And more importantly, for my purposes, it meant the house would remain occupied. No for sale sign would come down. No sold sign would go up. No moving trucks would appear in the driveway. From the street, everything would look exactly the same. Mrs. Albright, who hadn't found a new place yet, gratefully accepted. Now all the pieces were in place. My 2 other renovation projects were nearing completion, generating more capital. The trap was set, the bait was taken, and the target was completely oblivious. The power was mine, held in secret, waiting for the perfect moment to be revealed. All I had to do was wait for Christmas. The first week of December settled over the city, dusting the streets with a fine layer of snow. Christmas lights blinked from every lamppost. For most people, it was a season of joy and anticipation. For me, it was the final countdown. The Oak Creek house was officially mine, a massive secret I carried with me everywhere. My 2 other Keystone properties were now fully renovated and had just gone on the market, poised to bring in another wave of profit. Everything was going according to plan. I was in control. I was sitting in my office, reviewing the final blueprints for a new project, when my personal cell phone rang. The screen flashed with a picture of my father. My heart did a little nervous flutter. We didn't talk often, not unless it was a holiday or my mother had prodded him to call. Our conversations were usually stilted, full of awkward silences. "Hi, Dad," I said, trying to sound casual. "Amelia." "Hi, sweetie," he began, and I could immediately hear the hesitation in his voice. It was the tone he used when he was about to ask for something or deliver disappointing news. "How are you doing?" "I'm good, Dad. Busy with work." "You?" "Oh, same old, same old." There was a pause. I could hear him take a deep breath on the other end of the line. "Listen, the reason I'm calling, it's about your Uncle Mark." I gripped the edge of my desk, my knuckles turning white. "What about him?" "Well, he's just devastated, honey," my father said, his voice thick with sympathy. "He found out last week. He lost that house in Oak Creek. Someone came in with an all-cash offer and just took it. He never even got a chance to counter. Carol is a mess, won't stop crying. She had already picked out curtains for every room. It's really hit him hard. He put so much of himself into getting that place." I stayed silent, letting him talk. My creation, my ghost company, was being discussed as some random faceless force of nature. It was a bizarre, out-of-body experience. "He feels like a failure," my dad continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Like he let his family down. I've never seen him so low." The word failure hung in the air between us. It was a word I knew intimately, a word Mark and my parents had associated with me for 2 long years. Hearing my father use it to describe his hero, his successful brother-in-law, was jarring. A part of me, the cold, vengeful part, felt a thrill of satisfaction. The plan was working even better than I had imagined. But then my father kept talking, and his next words felt like a punch to the gut. "Listen, Amelia," he said, his voice tentative, as if he were approaching a scared animal. "I know things are tough for you. I know you're still getting back on your feet with that computer job." My blood ran cold. He still thought I was doing mindless drafting work. He had no idea. "But maybe you could give Mark a call," he said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "Show some support. Better yet, maybe you could ask him for a job. He's expanding his office staff. He might have something for you, some filing or reception work. It would be a steady paycheck, and more importantly, it would show him that you're willing to learn from a real professional. It might cheer him up to feel like he's helping you out." This was my final test. The plea from my own father, who had stood by silently while I was humiliated, now asking me to go and beg for scraps from the very man I had just strategically and decisively crushed. The irony was so thick I could barely breathe. He had no idea he was asking the victor to pity the vanquished. He was asking the queen to bend the knee to the king she had just checkmated. For a terrifying moment, a wave of guilt washed over me. It was so powerful it made me dizzy. His description of Carol crying over curtains, of Mark feeling like a failure, it made them sound human, pathetic, but human. Was this too cruel? Was this revenge twisting me into something as ugly as them? Was I becoming Mark, enjoying the power I held over someone else's happiness? The victory suddenly felt sour, the emotional cost of it rising in my throat like bile. I squeezed my eyes shut. I saw my grandfather's watch on the cold glass of the pawnshop counter. I saw my parents' blank faces at the Christmas dinner table. I saw the dismissal in Mark's eyes as he called my life's work a dollhouse. I remembered the gnawing hunger, the bone-deep exhaustion, the terror of impending failure. They had never shown me this kind of concern. My father had never called to ask if I was okay after my company collapsed. He had never defended me. He had only offered disappointed silence. The hesitation didn't just pass, it hardened into steel. The guilt receded, replaced by the cold, clear certainty that this was justice. They had written my story for 2 years. Now, I was writing the ending. I took a slow, steadying breath. "I'll think about it, Dad," I said, my voice perfectly level, betraying none of the turmoil I had just felt. "Oh, good. That's great, sweetie. He'd really appreciate it." "I have to go, Dad." "A meeting." "Okay. I love you." "Love you too," I said, and hung up the phone. I sat there in the quiet of my office, the echo of my father's cluelessness ringing in my ears. The emotional cost of my victory was real. It was the chasm that had just opened up between me and my father, a gap he couldn't even see, but it was a price I was willing to pay. 1 year, 365 days since the night I had walked out of my parents' home, a ghost stripped of her dignity. Now, as I drove back to that same house for this year's Christmas dinner, I was a different kind of ghost, the kind that haunts. I wasn't in my old, sputtering sedan anymore. I pulled up to the curb in a sleek new electric car. It wasn't flashy like the sports car my cousin had gotten, but it was the top of its line, a quiet statement of cutting-edge success. I had traded my worn-out jeans and faded sweaters for an elegant, custom-tailored dark green dress. It was the kind of outfit that didn't need to shout to be heard. I was the picture of understated power. As I walked up the pathway, the familiar twinkling lights seemed to cast a different glow. Last year they had felt mocking. This year they felt like stage lights, illuminating the scene for a final act. I took a deep breath, smoothed down my dress, and rang the doorbell. My mother opened the door, her face a mixture of relief and surprise. "Amelia, you're here. And don't you look wonderful?" Her eyes did a quick appraising scan of my outfit, my car, my entire presence. I could see the gears turning in her head, trying to reconcile this version of me with the failing daughter she held in her mind. I stepped inside. The atmosphere was immediately, palpably different from last year. The forced cheer was gone, replaced by a thick, heavy tension that clung to the air like humidity. Aunt Carol was arranging ornaments on the mantelpiece, with jerky, aggressive movements, her face set in a brittle smile that didn't come close to her eyes. She offered me a curt nod that was more of a dismissal than a greeting. And then there was Uncle Mark. He was standing by the liquor cabinet, a half-empty glass of amber liquid in his hand. He looked deflated. The usual boisterous energy that radiated from him was gone, replaced by a sullen, bitter resentment. His shoulders were slumped, and his eyes, when they briefly met mine, were cold and tired. He looked older. He looked beaten. He was drinking more than usual, I noted, watching as he sloshed another 2 fingers of whiskey into his glass before I'd even taken my coat off. He was marinating in his own misery, and the whole family was being forced to marinate with him. My parents tiptoed around him, their movements cautious, their voices soft. They tried to draw me into small talk, asking about my job, the weather, the traffic. "So that computer work is going well then?" my father asked, gesturing vaguely toward my car outside. "It's going very well," I replied, my answer short, polite, and revealing nothing. I offered them a serene smile. I was a calm, detached observer, a quiet island in the middle of their churning sea of anxiety. I watched the scene unfold, a silent director who knew exactly how the play was going to end. Everyone was tiptoeing around the giant invisible elephant in the room, the lost house in Oak Creek. The subject was so painfully raw that its absence was a roaring presence. Grandma Helen, in her blissful ignorance, was the only one who seemed immune to the tension. "Amelia, dear, it's so good to see you," she said, giving my am a frail pat. "You look much healthier than last year. A steady job does a world of good for a person." Her words, which once would have stung, now felt quaint and ironic. I simply smiled and thanked her. We moved into the dining room. The table was set with the same fine china, the same polished silverware. I took my seat, the ghost returning to the scene of the crime. Mark sat heavily in his chair, staring into his drink. Carol picked at a bread roll, shredding it into a pile of crumbs on her plate. The tension was a coiled spring, wound tighter and tighter with every passing moment of strained silence. Everyone could feel it. The air was buzzing with unspoken words, with resentment and disappointment. They were all trapped in a miserable little play of their own making, and they had no idea I was holding the script. All I had to do was wait for my cue. The clinking of silverware against china was the only sound for what felt like an eternity. My mother tried to start a conversation about a neighbor's holiday decorations, but it died a quick, awkward death. My father cleared his throat, looked like he was about to speak, then seemed to think better of it. The silence stretched, thin and fragile, until it was ripped apart by the one person who couldn't bear it any longer. Uncle Mark pushed his chair back with a loud scrape, the sound grating in the quiet room. He had refilled his whiskey glass before sitting down, and it was already half empty. The alcohol had burned away his sullen silence, leaving behind a raw, ugly bitterness. He fixed his bloodshot eyes on me, the sole focus of his curdled misery. "Well, well," he slurred, his voice dripping with a venom that silenced the entire table. "Look at you, Amelia, dressed to the nines, driving a fancy electric car." He gestured vaguely toward the window. "Must have gotten a nice little Christmas bonus at that computer job." He paused, letting his words hang in the air. This was his stage, and he was determined to play the leading role. "But you know," he continued, leaning forward with a conspiratorial sneer, "a nice car and a fancy dress don't make a home. They're just things. They don't mean you've actually built anything." He savored the word, his favorite measure of a person's worth. Then he delivered the line I had been waiting a full year to hear. The words were almost identical, a perfect echo of the blow that had started it all. "So, tell me, still happy in that little apartment, Amelia? I guess some people are just meant to stay small." It was my cue. It was perfect, right on schedule. As if summoned by his words, the doorbell rang. The chime cut through the tense atmosphere, making everyone jump. My mother frowned. Who could that be at this hour? "I'll get it," I said calmly, placing my napkin on the table. But before I could even stand up, the dining room door swung open. Chloe stood in the doorway. She was the picture of professional poise, dressed in an impeccably tailored dark gray suit, her hair pulled back in a sleek bun. She held a professional leather portfolio in her hand. She looked like she had just stepped out of a boardroom, a creature from a different, more serious world than this sad family drama. Her eyes scanned the room, found me, and she gave a slight, respectful nod. "Excuse the interruption, everyone," she said, her voice crisp, clear, and utterly confident. She looked directly at me. "Miss Evans, You asked me to bring this by for your signature. The final documents for the new acquisitions. The room went completely still. The use of Ms. Evans sent a ripple of pure confusion around the table. My mother's brow furrowed. My father stared, his fork frozen halfway to his mouth. Uncle Mark squinted at Chloe, then at me as if trying to solve a complex puzzle. I gave Chloe a small, appreciative smile. Thank you, Chloe. You're right on time. I took the portfolio from her. It felt heavy in my hands, heavy with the weight of my victory. I didn't open it right away. Instead, I turned my attention back to my uncle, who was watching me with a look of growing suspicion. Actually, Uncle Mark, I said, my voice smooth as glass. Speaking of homes, I've been meaning to talk to you about your current living situation. With a slow, deliberate movement, I turned the portfolio around and laid it flat on the table, facing him. I opened it. Inside, on top, was a single official-looking document. The title was printed in bold letters at the top, Certificate of Title. Below it, the property address was clearly visible, 1114 Whisperwind Lane, Oak Creek, and under the section marked Owner, the name was printed in sharp, undeniable black ink, Keystone Holdings, LLC. A collective gasp went through the room. My mother brought a hand to her mouth. Aunt Carol's face, which had been a mask of brittle pride, seemed to crumble. Uncle Mark stared at the paper, his face draining of all color. He looked from the deed to my face and back again. The alcohol-fueled bravado vanished, replaced by a dawning, horrified understanding. He sputtered, his mouth opening and closing like a fish on a dock. What is this? Keystone Holdings? Who is that? That's my company, I said quietly. Next to the deed in the portfolio was another document. I slid it out and pushed it gently across the polished wood of the table until it stopped right in front of his plate. It was a standard rental agreement. His name and Carol's were typed neatly at the top, as the prospective tenants for a different property, one of my newly renovated Keystone houses, a nice, respectable townhouse, but a far cry from the Oak Creek mansion he craved. I had my operations manager, Chloe, review the file, I said, my voice maintaining its serene calm. I believe your rental application was approved. Congratulations. Your first month's rent is due on the 1st. The room was utterly, profoundly silent. You could have heard a pin drop on the thick dining room rug. The air crackled with shattered assumptions. All the pity, the condescension, the smug superiority that had been directed at me for years had just been rendered meaningless. It was all built on a lie, and I had just exposed it. Mark looked at the rental agreement. He looked at the deed to his dream house, the one with my company's name on it. He looked at me, the niece he had dismissed as a pathetic failure. The pieces finally clicked into place in his wine-addled brain, forming a picture of his own colossal arrogance and my silent, meticulous revenge. His face contorted, a storm of disbelief, rage, and utter humiliation. You, he finally choked out, the word a strangled whisper of disbelief. You bought it? You bought it? The question hung in the dead air, a monument to his shattered worldview. He stared at me, his eyes wide with a horror that was, I had to admit, deeply satisfying to witness. My parents were frozen, looking back and forth between us, as if watching a tennis match, where one player had suddenly pulled out a cannon. Aunt Carol's face had crumpled completely, the facade of the proud real estate mogul's wife dissolving into the slack-jawed shock of a woman who just realized her throne was built on sand. I didn't answer his question immediately. I let him sit with it. I let them all sit with it, the full, crushing weight of the revelation settling upon them. I let the silence stretch, allowing the reality of the situation to burn away the fog of their condescension. Then, I gave him a cool, level look, my expression not triumphant, but matter-of-fact, as if explaining a simple business principle to a slow student. You were the one who always said that in real estate, the person with the capital makes the rules. Uncle Mark, I said, my voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the silent room. I just took your advice. This was the final, verbal checkmate. I had turned his own shallow, materialistic philosophy into the very weapon of his undoing. He had no response. There was no argument he could make. I had played his game, by his rules, and I had won so decisively that he was left with nothing. He slumped back in his chair, the fight draining out of him, leaving an empty, defeated husk. All his bluster, all his arrogance was gone. Aunt Carol let out a small, choked sob. The sound was pathetic. I stood up, the movement slow and graceful. My part in this little drama was over. I looked at Chloe, who was standing by the door, her expression neutral but her eyes gleaming with pride. She had been my silent witness, my accomplice. "Oh," I said, as if I had just remembered something. "I almost forgot my Christmas gift for you, Uncle Mark." Chloe, on cue, stepped forward. She was holding a small, beautifully wrapped gift box, tied with a perfect silver bow. She placed it on the table next to his trembling hand. For a moment, a flicker of insane, desperate hope crossed his face. Was it the keys? Was this all some elaborate, cruel joke? And I was about to give him the house after all. His hands fumbled with the ribbon, his fingers thick and clumsy. He tore the wrapping paper and lifted the lid of the box. Inside, nestled on a bed of black velvet, was not a shiny, new set of keys to his dream house in Oak Creek. It was a single, old, tarnished key. The brass was dull with age, and a faint patina of rust clung to its edges. It was the key to my old apartment, the shoebox. My voice was soft, almost a whisper, but it cut through the silence like a surgeon's scalpel. "That's the key to my old apartment, the one you love talking about so much," I said. "I moved out last week. It's available on the 1st of next month. I spoke to the landlord. I think the rent is something you can afford." Absolute, soul-crushing devastation. That was the only way to describe the look on his face. It wasn't just defeat, it was the complete annihilation of his pride. I hadn't just taken his dream house. I had offered him my nightmare in its place. He stared at the key as if it were a venomous snake, his body seeming to shrink in on itself. I placed my cloth napkin neatly on the table beside my untouched plate. I looked at my parents. Their faces were a kaleidoscope of shock, confusion, and a dawning, horrified respect. They finally saw me. Not as the disappointing daughter, but as a force they had completely and totally underestimated. "I have to go," I said, my voice gentle now. "I have an early meeting tomorrow." I looked at my mother, whose hand was still pressed against her mouth. "I'll call you tomorrow," I added. It wasn't a promise of reconciliation. It was a statement of fact. The power dynamic in this family had been permanently rewritten, and we would all have to learn our new roles. Without another word, I turned. Chloe held the door open for me, and we walked out of the dining room, leaving the smoking ruins of my family's worldview behind us. We didn't rush. We walked with the calm, unhurried pace of people who have already won. As we stepped out into the cold, crisp night air, I felt a profound sense of release. It wasn't the giddy thrill of victory. It was something deeper, quieter. It was peace. Later that night, I wasn't in my old apartment or a sterile hotel. I was in my own new home, a stunning, minimalist penthouse I had designed and built for myself. With the profits from the first two Keystone projects, it was my sanctuary, a place that was truly mine, built not with anger, but with talent and resilience. I stood at the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out at the vast, glittering tapestry of the city lights. The revenge had been a means to an end. It was the scaffolding I had needed to rebuild my life. The satisfaction of seeing Mark's face crumble was real, but it was fleeting. The real victory was this: the quiet, the profound, unshakable knowledge that I had not only reclaimed my narrative, but had built it into a skyscraper. The ghost of Christmas past was finally laid to rest. So, I'll ask you again. Have you ever been so underestimated that it lit a fire in you? Tell me in the comments what you did to finally prove them all wrong.